Planning a fishing trip shouldn't feel like a full-time job. With FishingBooker.com, you can find and book the perfect fishing trip within minutes. FishingBooker.com connects you with trusted fishing captains around the world. Booking is fast, easy, and secure, with access to verified customer reviews, loyalty rewards, and around-the-clock customer support. Everything you need to book with confidence is in one place. So head to FishingBooker.com and start planning your next fishing adventure today. Planning a fishing trip shouldn't feel like a full-time job. With FishingBooker.com, you can find and book the perfect fishing trip within minutes. FishingBooker.com connects you with trusted fishing captains around the world. Booking is fast, easy, and secure, with access to verified customer reviews, loyalty rewards, and around-the-clock customer support. Everything you need to book with confidence is in one place. So head to FishingBooker.com and start planning your next fishing adventure today.
Hey everybody, sorry that we took a little leave of absence. Adam and I were on the road, and for whatever reason, our schedule was packed and we did not have time to record some podcasts, so we're back in action again. I guess you'd call it like our summer vacation in a way, even though we were working. But let's get into this. Long before refrigeration, fat was more than just a cooking medium. It was protection. A seal against air, a barrier against spoilage, a way to stretch food through winter, travel, and scarcity. Meat submerged beneath cooled duck fat, fish packed into crocks of oil, rendered tallow stored for months, mushrooms preserved under aromatic fat. And somewhere along the line, people discovered something else. Fat didn't just preserve food, it transformed it. Tough legs became silky. Lean game became rich. Scraps became luxurious. Today we're talking about confit, rendered fats, potted meats, and oil preservation. How these techniques developed, why they worked, where they can go wrong, and how they still fit into modern wild food cooking.
Join Justin Townsend and the Harvesting Nature crew as they explore the world of cooking wild fish and game while sharing recipes, tips, tricks, and lessons learned from their pursuit of wild food. We sure hope you ate before the show, 'cause you're gonna leave hungry. This is the Wild Fish and Game Podcast.
Welcome back to the Wild Pantry. Adam and I have been on the road a bit, so apologies for the delay in the episodes. We're back and ready to rock and roll. We've got a cool set list for you all the rest of the summer. I think we're starting to gather more guests. I think we've inadvertently seen your feedback via listening stats, and there's an appetite, pun intended, for more guests. So we're back on that roller coaster of a ride of asking people to come on the show. So if you want to come on the show, or you know somebody that wants to come on the show, reach out to us, what'scooking@harvestingnature.com, or hit us up at harvestingnature on Instagram, and we'll be happy to coordinate some time to chat on a podcast episode. So we're going to continue on with our Wild Pantry series. This is a pretty awesome series. I really enjoyed this, diving into kind of the technique side of things. So over our last several Wild Pantry episodes, we've been working through some of humanity's oldest preservation techniques. So far, we've talked about curing, we've talked about freezing, we've talked about drying, we've talked about smoking. And today's topic's a little different because instead of removing moisture or cold storing food, this method relies on something many people assume spoils food faster. And that's a good point in the conversation we're going to dive into a bit, but it's fat. And specifically, as I mentioned in the little intro, we're talking about confit, we're talking about rendering, we're talking about rillettes, potted meats, fish preserved in oil. So many global preservation techniques and traditions can involve fat. It's very similar to cold smoking, where there are like some very important safety considerations that you need to understand. This is very specific when you have oil and low oxygen environments. When those become involved, things get a little sketchy, so you got to make sure you follow the steps properly. So we'll tackle that directly as we go along. But first, I'm going to kick it over to Adam to talk about some history. Where does confit come from?
Yeah, because in talking about this, confit is usually what hunters and anglers hear the most when it comes to, the talking heads on our side of things saying, you should confit. It's easy, it's good. But what is it and where does it come from? So confit is one of those culinary terms that people often associate with, fancy French restaurant food, which is funny. You hear like duck confit, the crispy skin, like a wine sauce, roasted potatoes. And I've actually encountered people who say like when offered confit, they're like, oh, I don't like that fancy French stuff. But it's funny because historically confit was a preservation food, and that generally meant, like a peasant or a farmer's food. So all these people saying they don't like this fancy French stuff are turning their nose up at something that was a very common farmer food, much like a stew or something today. The word itself comes from the French verb confire, which means to preserve. And the technique is most strongly associated with I think they're provinces in France, not states, but I could be mistaken, but the Gascony, and that's in southwestern France. And in Gascony, duck and goose were very abundant. Winters could be quite difficult, and refrigeration obviously didn't really exist at the time. So confit was a technique that was used to preserve meats for a longer time without refrigeration. And the process itself is relatively straightforward. Birds would be butchered seasonally. Probably would have started with wild game and eventually moved into domestic fowl. They'd be heavily salted, slowly cooked in their own rendered fat, then packed into crocks or cellar containers. So think of a big like clay ceramic crock, sealed beneath a thick layer of cooled fat. So that fat barrier actually helped reduce oxygen exposure and microbial activity combined with the salt. And when combined with that salt with cool storage temperatures, so they'd be kept in the cellar of stone houses, careful preparation using cleanliness, it allowed the meat to last far longer than fresh meat otherwise would have. And important, this wasn't really luxury cooking. It was very, very practical. You preserved the legs because they were tougher cuts and because the preservation mattered because you needed to stretch that meat into the hungry season. But something interesting happened along the way. People realized that slow cooking in fat didn't just preserve the meat, which was its prime purpose. It radically improved it, as anyone who's tasted confit can attest to. That connective tissue and those really tough legs softened. The texture of the meat became very silky and soft, and that flavor really concentrated. So you get all these big umami notes and lots of the natural flavor of the bird. Over time, confit evolved from necessity into delicacy. You can see this, happening all over the world, where all these old school techniques were kind of replaced by refrigeration. So in Eastern Europe, pork was often preserved beneath lard. If you've ever been through like an Eastern European market, you notice like kind of crocks of pork fat with like ribs in it or cracklings or different things. It's delicious if you can get your hands on it. Britain, potted meats were made basically just with seals of clarified butter fat. So something very similar to the confit method in France. Rillette developed as shredded preserved meat packed in fat, very similar to confit. Somewhere in between confit and pate. Parts of Mexico, carnitas use slow fat cooking that shares a lot of conceptual overlap with confit. It's generally not stored in the same way, but it's cooked in the same way, and you get a very flavorful end product out of it. Also across the Mediterranean, fish has long been preserved in olive oil in a very similar technique. Just look at all the incredible canned fish products available there from like Spain and Portugal and Italy. If you've ever had those like kind of expensive tinned seafood cans, are so good. Yes. And that's basically the same sort of preservation, just with generally in Mediterranean it'd be olive oil rather than animal fats, just due to the lack of animals available. Even outside meat and fish, people preserve foods in fat and oil because fat could act as both a flavor carrier and a protective layer. So the details varied across the board, but the core idea stayed pretty consistent. Cook something gently, reduce the moisture, limit oxygen exposure, and use salt and fat together. And honestly, that logic kind of fits wild food extremely well because wild foods often can be very lean, can cook unpredictably, come from animals that are older or with tougher working muscles than domestic. And confit and fat preservation really excels at transforming exactly those kinds of ingredients. Another one to mention is also mushrooms, which were applied with a similar technique. So if you had a glut of mushrooms or you had a glut of animal all at once, you could preserve that over a long time and actually make it taste better. So that's kind of the history. Could you tell us what's actually happening during the process of confit?
Yes, I will. But first, let's talk about the delicious confit pheasant we made at the Professional Outdoor Media Association,
Very
where
true,
we
yeah.
confit like 50 pheasants.
Yeah, that was probably the biggest vat of confit I've ever made.
So it is possible. Tell us what tell everybody what we did.
So basically, we attended the POMA conference, which is a Professional Outdoor Media Association. They brought us over to cook a wild game meal for everyone, which is a lot of fun. How many people do you think were there? Was it 125 or
125, yeah, roughly.
Yeah. We kind of walked into it with like an ever-changing list of wild game that would be available to cook for us, which often happens at these events because people promise to donate some, and it doesn't always happen. So we were kind of walking in not knowing exactly what we're going to be able to cook. Justin did an amazing job transforming a bag of random venison into a delicious kind of braised Choctaw-inspired dish, which is delicious.
Out of our new book, Cooking by Cuts.
Yeah, right out of our new book. And then we got a hold of about 50 pheasants and did a big vat of confit. And lacking all the things that we have in our own kitchens, often we didn't have a lot of duck fat or different types of fats to preserve. So we actually used olive oil, much like the Mediterranean style. And it shows that any fat is a great medium to do this kind of thing. You don't need necessarily pheasant fat to confit pheasant. In the end, if I were at home, I would have made a smaller batch and it would have taken much more time to do so. But, you're in certain conditions in the kitchen. You can't do the exact thing at home. So we did our best and made confit out of 50 pheasants. And we got a lot of good feedback from it. I think everyone
it was really delicious. Like I ate some. It was great.
Yeah. So we did, general salting. We had lots of garlic, some different herbs, some juniper, which is nice, and different aromatics, and just let it kind of slow cook all day and shred apart. And it was delicious. Really fun.
It was great. You did a great job with it, Adam. Now, let's talk about the science. Science. At its core, confit is a low temperature cooking and preservation method. Adam just said that. I've said it. Here you go. So you're usually taking a salted piece of meat and slowly cooking it submerged in fat at relatively low temperatures. So your temps are going to range probably 180 to 225 Fahrenheit. It's really important to keep those low temperatures because you're not trying to fry the meat. You don't want it like crispy as it sits in this phase. There shouldn't be any aggressive bubbling or browning. You're just like kind of letting it cook, just like unexcitedly sit there in this oil and just cook. And through that, you're slowly breaking down the connective tissue and you're minimizing moisture loss, which is really important because we're talking about game and fish and things here that are relatively lean. And that whole process is going to give you a different texture. It's going to be much different than roasting or braising because when you're braising, you're cooking with water-based liquid, like stock, wine, tomato, sauce, whatever. In confit, it's the fat, right? And fat transfers heat differently than water. And it creates this like incredibly silky texture because the meat cooks gently and evenly while it's like protected from direct drying because you're eliminating that exposure to air, and the oil kind of creates a barrier around the product to reduce the amount of moisture that's coming out of it. So you end up with something that's very rich and soft, and like Adam mentioned in his description of what the pheasant's like, this shreddable, like pull apart, almost just like you can smush it between your fingers. But on the preservation side, there's several things that are kind of happening. You've got salt in there, which is a very key thing. We've talked a lot about salt in our preservation thing. So that's reducing your microbial activity. You're cooking, reducing your water activity, and the fat's limiting the oxygen exposure, like I mentioned. But the fat alone's not this like magic preservation armor, right? It's not going to keep you completely safe, right? Because traditional confit preservations relied on high salt, careful rendering, cool cellar temperatures for storage, and a relatively dry finished product, right? So modern refrigeration has kind of like changed that equation a little bit. Most home confit today should still be refrigerated unless you're following like rigorously tested preservation methods. And I'm going to say too, like, I don't know as far as pressure canning and stuff, if they recommend confit for pressure canning.
I'm not sure about that. I would avoid it unless you can find some irrefutable proof, not from some guy, but from like a canning institute or preservation things, like government institutes.
Like, the USDA has pretty significant amount of research on canning. Like, it's been a widely used preservation technique for a long, long time. And I know they put a lot of stock into putting out guides on safety and stuff like that. So people were dying of botulism, which is understandable. So that's the part that we have to be really careful about, is the oil preservation and botulism. Like, because the oil and fats create a low oxygen environment, that's where botulism bacteria like thrives. While these are really great techniques, they're techniques that you have to be very precise about and respect. So I would say, if you're going to confit something, don't lean on it as much as a long-term preservation technique as like a short-term preservation and cooking technique, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you mentioned in the past, they would use like heavily salted food.
Yes.
Food that you might even have to soak afterwards once you remove it from the fat, and that's not what we're looking for these days. We don't need to preserve stuff like that these days, so we're looking at it from more the flavor aspect, which you don't need as much salt to do so, but it takes away from that preservation side of things. So yeah, if you're really interested in pursuing the preservation side, you're going to need a lot more research than what we're offering here. But
yeah, and I would say careful. While salt is a great tool, salt's also a great enemy. We've seen that through medical research over time. I was just reading an article the other day about high rates of stomach cancer in specific regions in Korea. I think they came to the conclusion was that the evolution of kimchi over time, a high amount of salt due to like change in even preservation methods, while maintaining higher amounts of salt, actually eroded some of the natural bacteria in the stomach and invited specific bacteria that lives in kimchi to come into your gut and like basically take form in like do damage and result in cancer, which is wild because like there's so much good microbial content in kimchi, and then to have like the salt come through and like be the wrecking ball that screws up your stomach and then allow like natural bacteria to come in and also be the dynamite to the wrecking ball is wild. But just think through that. Salt's great, but salt's also one of those things that we know it can be harmful as well.
Yeah, and we'll get into the safety a little bit more in this podcast.
But now Adam's going to talk about rendering fat.
Yeah, let's get into, we're talking about using liquid fat to preserve things. The liquid fat then kind of settles and cools into solids. But how do you get that liquid fat to begin with? And to do that, you have to render fat.
You have to squeeze those olives.
Yeah, squeeze them as hard as you can. So rendering is basically the process of slowly separating pure fat from, connective tissues, skin, proteins, moisture, all that kind of stuff. Once you start processing your own wild game regularly, rendering becomes incredibly useful, and I recommend everyone do it. Raw fat actually doesn't store particularly well, especially in the freezer. It can go rancid. We recommend often cutting the fat off of cuts of meat because it does make the meat last longer in the freezer. But weirdly, if you render fat, it lasts for way longer stored, even under your sink or in a pantry or in the fridge. Where if you try to store it raw in the freezer, it will go bad very quickly. And that's despite the fact that a lot of people assume that fat kind of freezes indefinitely, but fats, and especially unsaturated fats, so you're talking about like maybe like duck skin or intramuscular fat and a couple different things like that, can oxidize and go rancid surprisingly quickly, way faster than lean meats. While game fat also tends to absorb off flavors from the freezer more aggressively than lean meat. I don't know the science behind that, but it seems to be true anecdotally for me anyways. That's one reason why a package of old venison trims can sometimes taste really like freezery, in quotes, long before the meat itself fully even deteriorates. So rendering actually helps stabilize things. You're removing moisture, you're removing impurities, and you're creating a cleaner cooking fat with a much longer usable lifespan. Now, different fats behave very differently. You got to remember that. Duck and goose fat are probably the gold standard for wild food rendering. You can render their skin, their body fats, trimmings, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's mostly because they have a good mix of saturated and unsaturated fats, where something like beef or venison fat is highly saturated. So to render waterfowl fat, you basically chop everything small. So any fat you find, when you're pulling out the guts, there's those like pockets of fat near the thighs, all the skin, any fat you find, chop it all small, add a splash of water to prevent early scorching, and slowly cook it over low heat until the fat liquefies and the solids, called cracklings or grabenes, depending on where you're from, become golden. Then you strain it. So that early water, adding it is not necessary, but it helps the fat start to render before it starts to like sear in the pan, which you don't want. You want all this done at a very low temperature. Once you get all these nice golden cracklings, you strain it. So I would strain it with like some cheesecloth or with some, like a sieve lined with paper towel, because you want to get rid of all the impurities and little crispy bits. You can freeze that fat from there, or you can refrigerate it for a very long time, probably like a year or several months. Turkey fat works really well as well, but there's not much fat on a turkey. But I do render turkey fat, and I like cooking turkey in turkey fat. Is great. Pork fat is very forgiving and an excellent tool as well, especially if you're doing something like venison confit. If you can get your hands on some pork fat from the butcher, sometimes they'll just give it to you. Even render that out and use it. It is delicious. If you're looking at your own animals that you're butchering, the leaf lard, which is found around the kidneys, especially renders into a very clean, neutral fat. That fat used to be used for baking back in the day because it didn't have any, porkiness when it came from a pig. So it's a nice neutral fat for using. Deer and elk fat, or any of these cervids, are a bit of a different story. So a lot of hunters dislike the flavor and texture of deer tallow because it can feel waxy, can kind of coat the mouth, it can taste that gamey word that we don't like, especially when cold. That's because cervid fat has a higher melting point than something like duck fat. That's due to that saturated fat, as well as stearic acid and some other acids within the fat. But that doesn't mean it's useless. Remember that. You don't have to throw it all out. Some does I've butchered have been so fatty, like corn-fed does in the south. There's so much fat to work with. Rendered deer tallow still works well for frying, roasting potatoes, cooking at camp, making sausages, blending with other fats. Also, outside of the cooking world, making soap, as Justin's done. Historically, people absolutely used it. It wouldn't have been thrown away. You just need to understand its personality and work with it. The rendering process itself is similar to the duck. It's low heat, chop into small pieces, cook very slowly, strain very carefully. The one thing to avoid with any rendering is high heat. If you scorch those solids, that entire batch can develop bitter flavors and it's not going to be as good. So low and slow. That's the entire game here. Once you start rendering regularly, you suddenly realize how much value actually exists in parts people often discard, which is great. You can use so much more of your animal. So can you confit in deer tallow? Technically, yes. Practically, maybe sometimes, but the challenge with deer tallow is that its texture and melting point are so different. Traditional duck confit works so beautifully, partly because duck fat stays relatively soft and luscious even when cooled. Deer tallow firms up much harder and can develop a waxy mouthfeel. So breaking into that jar of duck confit, you can pull things right out of that soft kind of rendered fat, but deer tallow you're gonna need like an ice pick to get through it. So because of that, it can feel kind of heavier, less luxurious, a pain in the ass sometimes. But it can still be used for like venison shanks, older deer, strongly flavored meats, and you can confit venison with other fats, which is really what I recommend, whether that's pork or chicken or olive oil or anything like that. You can also mix your fats, like deer tallow and some pork fat, or deer tallow and some duck fat will help soften the end result. You also don't need, this is a big one too, gallons and gallons of fat. Try to work smart. Use a smaller vessel where the meat is tightly packed rather than using a big pot and you got to fill the whole thing up with fat, because fat is sometimes a difficult resource to get and takes a lot of work to render. So work smartly with your containers so you use as little fat as possible to cover the meat. And honestly, confit is one of the best arguments for keeping legs on wild birds and small game. So moving back into birds, think of those turkey legs, those goose legs, those duck legs, the hare or the tough old rabbit, or the kind of tough squirrel. They all become incredibly soft through slow fat cooking, soft and delicious. So confit can take those cuts that might otherwise feel tough or inconvenient and are often left in the field, which we all agree is a crime, and turns into something so luxurious you cannot believe that you would have left them not brought them home. And that transformation is part of why the technique survived so long after refrigeration arrived. A lot of these techniques kind of disappear or are very niche, but confit is still widely accepted and widely done. And I think it's because it's so delicious.
This episode is brought to you by Fox One. Watch all 104 matches of the FIFA World Cup live in 4K for just $19.99 a month with 3 days free. Build your own multi-view, choose up to 3 streams, and follow player spotlights. Stay on top of every moment with live stats, highlights, and instant replays. The FIFA World Cup, streaming live on Fox One. Offers are subject to change. See fox.com for complete terms and conditions.
Do you hear that? Sounds like breakfast is ready. Because Quaker's coming in hot with morning nutrition. 100% whole grain oats and a good source of fiber to fuel the rhythm of your morning and kickstart your day. And that sounds absolutely delicious. Fuel to start whatever's next. Quaker, official sponsor of FIFA World Cup 26.
Moving on from Confit, there's also things like Rillette and potted meat.
We're not talking about like off the grocery store shelf potted meat. No. We're going back traditional here. And I think this is something I have like such young memories of my grandfather who was very passionate about canned potted meat from the grocery store, which closely resembles cat food. It's not what we're going
in flavor
for
and texture.
In flavor and texture. Yeah, you spread it on crackers or sandwiches or... It was a very interesting combination of like potted meat and pimento cheese spread. Like lots of things going on there. But not to hate on it because done in a more DIY manner, phenomenal combination. So let's talk a little bit about it. So let's think through rillettes, which largely Adam knows I'm a huge Rillette fan. Every time we have a camp or anything, we make rillettes. So they're fantastic for wild game. And what are rillettes? So traditionally, slow cooking meat in fat until it becomes soft enough to shred. I would say you can cook the meat slow until it becomes shreddable and then add a bunch of fat into it. Is probably a more modern application of it. Otherwise, you're still just kind of conveying things. But you put enough fat back into it as it's cooked that it becomes a spreadable paste. So you kind of have your potted meat and then your rillettes. It's either a difference of kind of like a ground or chopped meat versus like a shreddable or shredded kind of paste. Duck rillettes are classic. But you can also do goose, rabbit, wild turkey, even smoked fish, and wild pig heads, which is what we traditionally use it for because it's like a phenomenal combination. British potted meats are very similar. Historically, they're packed in containers and sealed beneath clarified butter or fat to extend the storage life. But here we have this refrigeration challenge. So the concept still works extremely well. Now we're refrigerating things, so we don't have to rely as much on the preservation. We probably also don't get as many stomach bugs. But you can stretch tougher cuts using these two methods. You can preserve flavor and you can create really like ready to eat foods, which is pretty cool. So these were and have been historically significant, and they continue to be like phenomenal ways to use meats, especially if you're just like, I want to try something new. I've got, a pile of trim that I want to, grind up, and maybe I don't have enough to turn into sausage or turn into something, meatballs or whatever, but you want to try like one of these methods. I think look, a mason jar and some cooked, shredded, potted meat, rillettes, or anything. It's like really, really phenomenal. So there's something really satisfying about taking all these kind of scraps, offcuts, little bits, and turning them to something you can just spread on a piece of toast and really enjoy. It takes something that would otherwise be discarded and turns it into something very gourmet. Turn my pinky up.
I like the idea too, which you mentioned, of just having something in the fridge. Like a lot of wild game takes time to cook and takes a lot of effort and thinking about it and being there, presence. You got to cook it properly. But once you do that, once you make confit or rillette or potted meat or any of these things, you just have it in the fridge. It becomes this super accessible wild food to snack on. If it's confit, you can take a whole egg, say a whole duck leg out of the fat, fry it up, and then you got this gourmet meal in front of you that took 5 minutes. Or if you have like a jar of rillette in the fridge, you can put on some toast or crackers. If you have unexpected guests, you can just break it out and make a little ad hoc charcuterie tray with some of this stuff, and people will be amazed. You can also flavor it the way you want, which is really cool. Like one I recently made was like a maple syrup and whiskey goose leg rillette. Maple syrup and whiskey go really good together and work really well in these preparations. But you could go make like a gochujang Korean one or like a traditional Eastern European one. There's just so many ways to do it. And moving outside of the rendered fat, there's also the oil preservation side of things. So moving away from the classic confit, there's a pretty broad world of oil preservation. Fish preserved in oil is probably one of the oldest and still best examples in modernity. So think like tuna or sardines or anchovies or salmon, trout. Cooking fish gently, then storing it submerged beneath oil creates something completely different texturally than fresh fish. It's really beautiful. And something you can do too is use smoked fish for any of these. If you want to make like smoked trout rillettes or smoked salmon preserved in oil, that's another element that's really crazy and really delicious. Mushrooms are another great candidate. Oil preserved mushrooms become really deeply savory, concentrated, and the texture changes a little bit. You find those all throughout Eastern Europe, and they know what they're doing over there. They do it very, very well. There's lots of cool recipes online for that, so I'd check that out for sure. And then this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that's things like chili crisp. Hopefully you know what chili crisp is by now. It's kind of like a Chinese ingredient. It's a mild to spicy chili oil full of crispy, crunchy, delicious things in the bottom that you can just put over rice, put over anything. Lao Gan Ma is the probably most popular brand. It's got like a stern older woman on the front of it. Really delicious. But chili crisp fits surprisingly well into this conversation because at its core, chili crisp is just basically a flavored oil preserve. So you're combining like fried aromatics, chilies, sometimes mushrooms, sometimes even meat, and sometimes seafood. A lot of the best chili crisps have dried scallops or dried shrimp or even preserved meat inside, which are rare, but you can find them in China and you can make them at home. So all these things are just inside stabilized fat or oil. That's basically exactly what we're talking about. And wild ingredients work beautifully here. So wild mushrooms, morels, hedgehogs, black trumpets, all those can become incredible in chili crisp style applications. You could also make like duck breast chili crisp, goose chili crisp, mushroom chili crisp. It's lots of different options. And something that's a little more modern and not yet talked about in this sphere. You got a lot of people talking about, confit and oil rendering and fat rendering, all this stuff, but not many people are talking about chili crisps yet. And I think that's like a big new kind of horizon for this. When making this
acorn chili crisp,
there you go. Yeah.
Pinyon pine nut chili crisp.
Why not?
All kinds of wild seeds and stuff too.
Yeah. So if you're just thinking something flavorful and crispy and crunchy to add to it.
Yeah.
So good.
Maybe like, what are they? Cattail bases?
Yeah, like the raisins.
Yeah, crispy fried.
Yep. I know there in some parts, I don't know much about it, but in the Southwest and maybe in Mexico, there's still wild chilies growing around. Like it'd be cool to make chili crisp out of some wild chilies. It'd be neat.
Well, you have also like salsa macha.
Yeah, exactly. Which is basically Mexican chili crisp.
Yeah.
So you could make it in such a way that you could preserve it as well. And that oil preservation is really cool because it's not just preserving calories for the future, for like stretching your meat out, but it preserves the aroma. You can really customize it with herbs, spices, smoke, chilies, garlic, all these things, because fat really carries those flavors incredibly well. Fat carries flavor, and you can really tell that in, say, like pork tenderloin versus the nice fatty pork chop. There's so much more flavor. These techniques aren't just about shelf life, they're actually about concentration and transformation, which is the cool modern aspect of all this.
The new LinkedIn Hiring Pro can't undo your last hire. The empty seat. Who was actually just that, an empty chair in your office because you couldn't find someone to fill it. So it just sat there costing you money with all its fancy ergonomic features. But LinkedIn Hiring Pro can make it easy to fill that seat with the right candidate. With nearly 60% of businesses finding someone to interview in the first week alone. Hire right the first time with LinkedIn Hiring Pro. Post a free job today at linkedin.com/quality.
If we knew more about our sleep, what would we do differently? Would we go to bed at a consistent time or take steps to reduce interruptions to our sleep? With Sleep Score, Apple Watch measures your bedtime consistency, interruptions, and sleep duration. Then, every morning it combines these factors into an easy-to-understand score from 1 to 100. So you'll know how to take the quality of your sleep from okay to very high. Know your sleep score with Apple Watch. iPhone 11 or later required.
I do want to hit on the safety and botulism piece a little bit, and then we'll talk about, we've got a specific Confit recipe and actually a couple we'll go through and then we'll close out. So from a safety standpoint, this is probably the most important section of the episode because there's a lot that can go wrong and it's not great. Fat and oil preservation can absolutely be done safely, but they need to be approached intentionally, and the biggest concern is botulism. I've mentioned this before. I want to hit it again, and I want to be crystal clear. Botulism is no joke. It thrives in low oxygen, low acid, and moist environments, which is largely what we're talking about here. Oil creates that. The fat creates that. And things that are improperly stored, think about garlic and oil, mushrooms and oil, herbs and oil, fish and oil, meat and oil, can potentially become super dangerous. Don't overly panic about this, but you need to respect it. Modern best practices are pretty straightforward. Keep oil preserves refrigerated, limit moisture, use proper acidity where appropriate. Don't rely on folk preservation timelines from centuries ago to fully understand the process, because historically people often used more salt, cooler storage, shorter storage periods than we sometimes imagine. And with Confit specifically, refrigeration's your friend. We've got this modern tool. Use it. The same is true for fish preserved in oil. If you're preserving things like mushrooms in oil, they should generally be fully cooked, stored cold, consumed in a reasonable time frame. Garlic comes in as one of those classic examples because raw garlic submerged in oil creates ideal anaerobic conditions, and people do it a lot, and it's not great. So refrigeration matters, acidity matters, cleanliness matters, moisture management matters, cooking things matters. And here's kind of the last overarching thing. If something smells wrong, if bubbles strangely, if it spurts liquids, if it seems questionable, don't taste it. Remember science class? They're don't smell, don't taste. Just discard it. The good news is that modern refrigeration kind of helps with these techniques and makes it vastly safer than traditional ones. But be cautious when we talk about preservation. There's a way to do it. Follow the directions, research. If you question it, throw it out. If you don't question it, taste test it first and then serve it to people later. Don't be the next headline story of home cook kills 15 people and botched botulism case. Not great. So just be careful out there.
Yeah, I hear so much from hunters, especially hunters seem to be maybe because they're traditionally oriented or whatever, but it's just well, I've been doing this for years. My grandma did this for years. There's no problem. People have been eating this stuff for years and no one's died yet, which is such a bullshit excuse for this kind of stuff. Maybe they will die. Maybe what you've been doing is dangerous. Maybe you can speed at 200 miles an hour and not die for years, and then one day you're going to die doing it. Doing this properly is important, and don't risk your family's lives because you think that you know better than modern science and your granddaddy's done it for years. That's enough of that nonsense. There's science to help back this stuff up. Use it. Use those traditional recipes with science in mind. Use pink salt if you need it. Use the things that make this safe, and don't be an idiot about it. That's all we got to say. Don't argue against it just to prove your own point, or find the one guy online who agrees with you while hundreds others don't. Which my friend did, and he made this huge thing Confit and spoiled it and almost killed his whole family because he didn't listen to me. He found the one guy online who agreed with him. Don't do that. Don't be that guy. Anyways, to do it properly, we will have a Confit how-to thing on Harvesting Nature for you to do it. So we're going to list everything, have it all there for you, so you don't have to take any guesses. That's available on the Harvesting Nature website. And we actually have a really cool recipe by Heidi Chaya. It's a Confit venison shank. So something to do with those really tough, big venison shanks you don't really know what to do with. Confit it. Use Heidi's recipe. It'll be delicious.
So I'll just kind of close this out here real quick. Confit and fat preservation, they still sit in really interesting places historically. They began as practical preservation techniques, ways to stretch food through the seasons when nothing could be wasted. But unlike some preservation method, there's also ones that happen to make food deeply luxurious, right? We've talked about this, all those descriptors. Lean close to your speaker. Silky textures, rich flavors, tender meat, concentrated aromatics. That's what Confit and fat preservation gives you, and it's really, really good. So even today with modern refrigeration, these techniques are still hugely valuable, and I really like them. Not just because they preserve food, but because they transform it and make this something like really awesome. Don't make me whisper into the mic again. Next time on Wild Pantry, we'll dive into pickling and acid preservation, which is going to be fun because we're not just going to talk about pickling vegetables. We're going to talk about pickling everything. So thanks everybody for listening. I really appreciate it. Head over to whatever podcast platform you listen to. Punch that 5-star button. Leave us a review. Tell us we're doing right, or tell us that we suck and Confit's for losers. Don't do that because it's not. All right. Talk to you later.